My name is Jason Maxwell, and I am a police officer in a small town in Montana. I never thought that my work would turn into something so terrible. These were usually simple patrols, occasional minor violations, and sometimes calls for overly noisy neighbors. But one night changed everything. I was finishing my usual report when a strange call came on the console. Neighbors in the area reported suspicious activity at the home, which they believed was supposed to be vacant. I was going to turn this call over to another patrol, but something in my head told me to check it out myself. Driving up to the house, I noticed that all the windows were closed and only one light flickered in the far room. I got out of the car, turned the radio on low, and slowly walked to the door. They were slightly open, and the cold breath of wind from inside passed over my skin, sending goosebumps. I took out my flashlight and started looking around the room. There was a strange smell in the air, like burnt wood mixed with something sweet. I walked past the dark corridors when I heard a whisper. It was barely audible, but it was definitely there. And suddenly, I realized that this is not an ordinary house. He was alive, and I just began to understand that I had stepped into the territory from which I may never return. This is just the beginning. Subsequent installments will be even more intense as Jason delves deeper into this terrifying world, where every night shift could be his last. My heart beat faster as I approached the door from which I could hear the whispers. The flashlight flickered and I had to shake it frequently to keep it on. Maybe it's just paranoia, but the shadows on the walls seemed to move with my breath. I was standing in front of the door. They looked as if they had not been opened for a long time, old, cracked, covered with dust. But the whispers were getting louder and clearer, as if someone was standing behind them. Gathering my strength, I put my hand on the handle and carefully opened it. Behind the door was darkness so thick that a flashlight could hardly penetrate it. Already beginning to regret that I decided to go alone, I took a step forward. The floor creaked underfoot, but it wasn't the usual sound of wood. It was something else, like the floor was alive. And then I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was a soft child's laugh that echoed somewhere deep within the darkness. He was so unusual and ominous that it made me shudder. I wanted to retreat, but something in me made me go on, pulling me forward like a rope. I took a few more steps when suddenly something firmly grabbed my leg. I barely managed to keep my balance and quickly pointed the flashlight at the floor, but saw nothing but darkness. My brain refused to accept what had happened, but it wasn't a hallucination. I definitely felt the cold fingers holding my leg. I fell to my knees, struggling to breathe, when suddenly I heard the door behind me slam shut with a loud creak. The room became even darker. And then, in the midst of this impenetrable darkness, I saw how dozens of eyes were looking at me. They were watching from every corner, from every shadow. Then I realized that I am not alone here, and what is here was clearly not happy about my presence. Jason becomes more and more involved in this unfathomable horror as he realizes that this night will be a true test on the edge of his life and sanity. I barely managed to keep myself from panicking. In the room, which was becoming more and more ominous, the darkness seemed alive, enveloping me, as if it was watching, waiting for something. I could hear the whispers around me getting louder, mixing with the uneven pounding of my heart. It seemed to come from everywhere, repeating words I couldn't make out. The light of the flashlight suddenly began to flicker, and I realized that the battery was almost dead. The last thing I wanted was to stay in this room with no light. I had to do something, and immediately. Taking a few steps back, I tried to remember how I got here. The whole situation seemed somewhat delusional. I had gotten out of my car to check out suspicious activity in an empty house, and now I found myself in some kind of horrible trap where reality had lost all meaning. My hand reached for the walkie-talkie on my belt. Maybe I could just call for help, but when I tried to turn it on, all I heard was static. "Damn it," I muttered, hitting the walkie-talkie, but it didn't work. All my attempts to get help seemed futile. Suddenly the whispers changed their tone. They became more pushy, aggressive if they tried to make me do something, and then I saw a figure emerge from the darkness. She looked human, but something was wrong. Her movements were unnatural, her face was blurred. My body became tense, but I couldn't move as this figure came closer and closer. I felt a terrible coldness, as if death were near. The feeling of losing time was so strong that I couldn't tell how many minutes or hours had passed since I entered this cursed house. And then the figure stopped in front of me. She tilted her head as if examining something, and then what I feared the most happened to her. She spoke. But the words that came out of her mouth were slurred, unintelligible sounds that tore me apart from the inside. I felt my body begin to submit to something I couldn't control. My own I began to disappear, to be lost in these terrible sounds. And then I heard her clear question, "Why did you come here?" I didn't know the answer. My head was spinning, and all I could feel was the fear that was growing by the second. Jason encounters a mysterious creature that threatens not only his life, but also his sanity. Will he be able to find the strength to escape this darkness, or will he become another victim of the cursed house? My body seemed to freeze. Those terrible words throbbed in my head. Why did you come here? The question felt like the creature already knew the answer, but still wanted to hear it from me. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. It was almost impossible to move, but I forced myself to answer. I'm a police officer, I answered, trying to regain control of my voice. But the words sounded empty if I didn't believe in what I was saying. The figure didn't move, just stared at me with its unnaturally empty gaze. There was something in her eyes that I couldn't describe. It was like an abyss that attracted and scared at the same time. And then she spoke again, but this time her voice was like an echo echoing in my head. You came here to find an answer, but are you ready to know the truth? I didn't know what to answer. Was I ready? I had no idea what awaited me here, but I intuitively understood. This being knew more than I could imagine. Her words seemed to pierce through me, leaving a deep trace of fear in my soul. I gathered my strength and tried to take a step back, but felt an invisible force hold me in place. It was impossible to retreat. I was imprisoned in this eerie room where reality began to fall apart. Suddenly, the creature tilted its head and whispered so softly I could barely hear, "They're coming. You're not alone here, and you never will be." After these words, the room suddenly came to life. The whispers began to merge into one continuous flow of sounds that filled my consciousness. The ceiling and walls began to change, to blur, as if I was standing in the center of a terrible nightmare from which there is no way out. I turned my head towards the exit and saw the door begin to open by itself. Behind them was not the same room from which I entered. It was another reality, where light and shadow played with my perception, making me question what I was seeing. I had to decide whether to stay here and find answers, or run away before it was too late. But did I have a choice? Jason is faced with a difficult choice. Try to find out the truth in this terrible trap or escape, risking leaving a part of himself in this cursed place. His fears are just beginning to unfold, but the real horror is yet to come. I stood in front of an open door, behind which there was a darkness that seemed to call me to it. My hand was shaking as I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I felt that this choice, to stay or to leave, would be decisive in my life. The creature standing before me seemed calm, as if it knew I had already made up my mind. She didn't make any more movements, didn't say any words, just looked at me with her empty gaze that penetrated to the very heart. Weighing all my fears and doubts, I took a step forward to the door. My body was heavy, as if my legs were filled with lead, but something urged me to move. Each step was taken with incredible effort, and when I finally crossed the threshold, I felt the darkness envelop me like a blanket. It seemed that the air had become thicker, almost impossible to breathe. I stopped and looked back for a moment, but the room I had just left was gone. Instead, there was only the same darkness. I realized that now there is no way back. The light of the flashlight was getting weaker with every second, but a weak beam of light appeared ahead, like some kind of distant light. I started moving in his direction, hoping to find answers to my questions or at least a way out of this nightmare. As I got closer, the light grew brighter. It was a small table lamp that stood on an old wooden table in the center of the room. I tried to understand where I was, but the space around me was so distorted that nothing made sense. The ceiling was too high, as if I was in a church, but the walls seemed to close at one point in the distance. On the table next to the lantern, there was an old leather book. It looked as if no one had opened it for decades. I moved closer and felt every cell in my body tense with anticipation. Something inside told me that this book held the answers, but it could also lead to even more horror. Opening the book, I saw that its pages were filled with incomprehensible symbols and drawings that reminded me of something sinister and ancient. But one drawing caught my attention. It was a scene depicting me as an officer standing in front of the same house I was in. Nearby is the same lantern and book I was holding. My heart beat faster when I realized that this book somehow related to my current state. I quickly turned the pages further, looking for clues. On the last page was written only one word: victim. I didn't have time to think anything more when suddenly the lantern went out, leaving me in complete darkness. And then I heard footsteps approaching me from all sides. Jason finds a mysterious book that reveals part of the mystery, but at the same time raises even more questions. What does the word victim mean? And who or what approaches him in the dark? Each next step leads him deeper and deeper into a terrible trap from which there may be no way out. Darkness enveloped me from all sides, clutching my throat with the invisible hands of fear. Footsteps came closer, echoing around me like echoes off walls I couldn't see. My body tensed and my thoughts froze in panic. I needed to do something, but my brain couldn't think of a solution. I tried to reach for the flashlight, but it was no longer responding. It seemed to me that the darkness was so thick that it absorbed any source of light. The steps became louder, as if those who were walking were nearby, almost breathing on the back of my neck. Suddenly, silence. The footsteps disappeared, and I was left alone in complete silence. But it was not the kind of silence that brings peace. It was an oppressive silence, a silence in which you could hear your heart beating. I felt the drops of sweat fall on my skin, and each one was like lead. And then a voice was heard from the darkness, not a whisper, as before, but a clear, even voice that sounded close to me. You have come to learn the truth, but are you ready to accept it? I turned at the sound, but saw no one. It felt like a voice was coming from inside me, but it wasn't my voice. It was something else, something deep within me that spoke to me. What do you mean? I asked, trying to control the trembling in my voice. The answer was as sudden as the question. You are a part of it, always have been and always will be. My mind could not comprehend what was happening. Each word of the voice tore my reality to shreds, leaving me in a state of complete astonishment. And suddenly I realized that something was wrong. This place, this house, it didn't just exist. It lived, it breathed, and I was a part of it as it was a part of me. At that moment, I realized that there was no turning back. All roads lead only forward, into an abyss from which there is no way out. I had to move on, find the answer, even if it meant losing myself in the process. Taking a step forward, I felt the floor change under my feet. It became smooth and cold, like marble, although a moment ago it was wooden. And then a weak light appeared from the darkness, showing the way forward. I didn't know where he was leading me, but I knew one thing. I had to follow him because there was no other choice. My fear was so strong that I almost felt physical pain, but every step forward was a step towards the solution. The space around me shifted with every movement. Walls stretched, rooms narrowed, and shadows danced in their eerie harmony. I walked forward, following the faint light that showed the way, and with each step I felt a piece of me being left behind. It was more than just a journey. It was a journey into the abyss, and I was just a player in this game where I didn't make the rules. Jason moves further into the unknown, following a ghostly light that promises answers but also carries with it an ever-increasing threat. Each step makes him a part of this terrible reality, which begins to swallow him whole. What awaits him ahead? Will he be able to find the truth and get out alive? With each step, the light ahead became a little brighter, but at the same time, the feeling of unease increased. I felt as if an invisible force was pulling me back, trying to keep me in the dark. But I went on, although every step was accompanied by a heavy thump in my chest, as if my heart protested the journey. Suddenly, I noticed that the environment around me had changed. Now I was not walking along the corridor of the house, but found myself on an endless, winding road that led to nowhere. Along this road, there was nothing but mist, which hung in heavy strands on either side like a cloud. Below, under my feet, I could see old, cracked stones that seemed to have been forgotten and left here for centuries. I looked around, but the darkness that had surrounded me before was gone. Now it was just me and this road that promised nothing but the unknown. I tried to figure out how I got here, but there was no answer. All I could do was move forward. Time lost its meaning. I didn't know how many hours or minutes had passed since I started this journey. Every step felt like an eternity, every breath a painful reminder that I was still alive. But at the same time, I felt that I was becoming a part of this road, this place, as if I had always existed here, just like the stones under my feet. And then I heard a whisper coming from everywhere. But these were not the whispers I had heard before. They were sharp, like stabbing the mind with a knife. They said that I would never be able to leave this place, that I was lost in time, like all those who had walked this path before. I quickened my steps, trying to escape from those voices, but they followed me without letting go. And then I saw a figure in the distance. At first I thought it was just a shadow, an illusion created by my tired mind. But the shape became clearer. She stood on the edge of the road as if waiting for me. When I got closer, I saw that it was a woman. Her face was almost invisible because of the thick fog, but I could feel her eyes on me. She didn't move, just silently watched. And then I realized that it was not just a woman. It was a part of this place, just like me now. "Who are you?" I asked, barely controlling my voice, which was shaking with fear. But instead of answering, the woman only extended her hand forward, indicating the continuation of the road. "He's waiting for you," she whispered, and these words pierced me to the core. I didn't know who she was talking about, but her words were too specific to ignore. I walked past her and continued walking forward, feeling her lag behind, but her gaze still following me. Time no longer mattered. I no longer knew where I was going, but this path was the only one left, and now a new figure appeared in front of me. She was taller and her features were hidden by an even thicker fog. But I knew one thing. This was the one I had to find, the one who knew all the answers. I picked up my pace, ready to face the unknown, even if it meant facing my own fear. Jason continues his journey down a seemingly endless road, meeting mysterious figures who give him clues. But what does their presence mean, and who is it that he must find? Each step brings him closer to the solution, but also plunges him into even greater darkness. The steps became heavier, as if each new movement took the last strength. The mysterious figure waiting ahead was inexplicable but magnetic. I couldn't bring myself to stop, even if I wanted to. Her presence was so powerful that it seemed to pull me like a gravitational force. As I approached, I felt the air around me become cold. It was not an ordinary cold. It penetrated the soul, made every cell of the body tremble with fear, and at the same time with a foreboding of something inevitable. As I got closer, the mist surrounding the figure began to dissipate. Before me stood a tall man in an old, worn overcoat, his face hidden under a broad hat. But I felt that his eyes were looking at me, piercingly, without pity, as if evaluating me, looking into my deepest fears. "You came," he said, his voice as cold as the air around him. His words were simple, but each letter echoed in my head. "What do you need from me?" I asked, although I doubted whether I wanted to hear the answer. The man took a step forward, and I felt the weight of his gaze increase. He didn't stop until he was right in front of me. I could only see his shadowy face, but that was enough to feel his power. "You are looking for the truth," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "But are you ready to accept her?" His words were again the same ones I had heard before. They seemed to haunt me, making me doubt every decision, every step I took along the way. "I don't know," I answered sincerely. I really wasn't sure I was ready for what lay ahead, but this uncertainty forced me to move forward because remaining in the dark was even scarier. "You were chosen for a reason," the man continued. "Your destiny has long been set, and everything you do only brings you closer to the end. But will you be ready to make a choice when the time comes?" "What choice?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. These mysterious conversations did not give me any answers, only confused me more. The man leaned closer, and I heard his breath, cold as a winter wind. "You'll see," he whispered, and at that moment his eyes flashed in the darkness like two lights burning from within. With that, he suddenly disappeared as if he had never been there. I was left alone in the fog, but now I knew that this place was changing me. I was no longer the policeman who entered this house. Something inside me had changed, and I didn't know if I could go back to my old life. There was only one path left, the one that led me further into the darkness, to the unknown choice he had mentioned. I felt that every step brought me closer to this meeting with fate, which could be my last test. Jason meets a mysterious man who speaks of fate and the choices that lie ahead. But what do his words mean, and what truth lies behind these cryptic hints? Jason moves on, knowing that something lies ahead that will change his life forever. I stood in a thick fog that was beginning to close in around me, as if trying to swallow my consciousness. The man who had just been in front of me disappeared, leaving behind only a feeling of cold fear and a foreboding of something unspeakable. But he left me with questions I didn't have answers to and choices I didn't even know existed. My gaze suddenly stopped at something strange. The mist began to clear, and before me appeared a picture that seemed to have no place in this world. In front of me was a portal, a circular opening in the air that shimmered in various shades of blue and green. It was like a window into another dimension, something that could not exist in reality. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side of this portal, but I felt that this was the only way forward. My consciousness was already beginning to lose touch with reality, and I understood that this could be the point of no return. But there was no choice. Taking one last deep breath, I stepped forward into the thick of the portal. It seemed to me that the space around me was closing, contracting, and expanding at the same time. It felt like I was falling into a bottomless abyss. The world around me disappeared, leaving only darkness and a feeling of weightlessness. And suddenly I found myself in a new place. It was a room, but not like the one in the old house. Here everything looked familiar and strange at the same time. The walls were covered in a pale light, and the furniture around it seemed old, but almost untouched. I felt a wave of déjà vu wash over me. I'd been here before, but I couldn't remember when or why. There was a mirror in the corner of the room. Its surface was almost transparent, but it reflected something else, not me. I came closer, tried to understand what was displayed there. The glare was indistinct, but gradually a face began to appear before my eyes. It was the face of a man I had never seen but felt as a part of me. The man in the mirror began to move. His lips moved, but there was no sound. He was showing me something, but I couldn't understand what it was. It was like looking at a reflection that suddenly took on a life of its own. And then I understood. It was the same man I met earlier. But now he was in me, or I was in him. Our destinies were intertwined in this place, which was more than just a room. It was something like a corridor between worlds, a place where reality bent and turned into something else. I didn't know how long I stood there watching my reflection. Time no longer mattered, but at some point I realized what I had to do. I reached out to the mirror, touched its cold surface, and then something incredible happened. The mirror began to suck me in, absorbing my body, my mind, everything that I was. The world around me changed again. Now I was in the dark, but this darkness was different. It was full of voices, whispers that whispered words to me about fate, about choice, about the terrible truth that awaited me ahead. And I realized that this is only the beginning of something that will turn my life upside down. Jason passes through a mysterious portal and enters a place that violates all the laws of reality. There, he encounters a reflection of himself, indicating that his fate is inextricably linked to something far greater and more terrifying than he could have imagined. New challenges are waiting for him ahead, and each step takes him further into the world of horrors. As the darkness around me began to dissipate, I realized that I was back in the old house. But something was different. The air became heavy and thick, as if the room itself was saturated with something invisible but felt at the level of intuition. This place was no longer just old and abandoned. It became alive, like a living organism watching me. I was standing in a large room that I did not remember from my previous exploration of the house. Its walls were decorated with antique paintings depicting scenes from the past, but they all had one thing in common. Each of them featured the same man I had seen earlier. He appeared sometimes as a figure in the background, then as the main character of the scene, but always with the same cold look. Walls, floors, furniture, everything looked almost untouched by time, as if the house had been preserved in its original beauty. But I knew it was just an illusion. This house was a trap, and I wasn't here by accident. In the very center of the room stood a large, round table on which lay an ancient book. It was decorated with ornate symbols that reminded of something ancient and forgotten. I came closer and saw that my name was stamped on its cover. It was impossible, but I knew it was. My hand trembled as I reached for the book, feeling every muscle tense with anticipation. As I opened the book, the pages began to slowly turn by themselves, stopping at a section that was completely dedicated to me. My story has been described here in minute detail, from the moment of my birth to the present moment. But more frighteningly, the book described a future I did not yet know. I read the lines that spoke of the events that were about to happen, the choices that I had to make, and the price that would have to be paid. These words made me tremble with fear, for they were so precise that there was no doubt of their truth. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It was quiet, but it permeated the space like a whisper in the silence. The voice did not come from outside, but from inside me. It was a voice from my past, familiar but distant. He reminded me of the events I tried to forget, the decisions that led me here. "Jason, you already know what you have to do," said the voice, as if speaking directly to my soul. "Who are you?" I whispered, trying to understand where the voice was coming from. "I am a part of you, a part of your past that you tried to leave behind. But now you are back, and this place reminds you of what was hidden from yourself." I remembered the night when my life changed forever. I was a young police officer when a man called me on patrol. He was old, with a face full of scars and a voice as cold as night. He told me something that I didn't understand at the time, but now everything is falling into place. "You must finish what you started then," the voice continued. "You must face what has been hidden and make a choice that will determine everything." I felt the cold seeping through me from the inside, but with it came the realization that it couldn't be avoided. My past came back, and now I had to find answers that I hadn't looked for before. Jason stumbles upon a creepy book that tells him his own story, including events that haven't happened yet. A voice from the past reminds him of unfinished business and forces him to make a choice that will have a decisive impact on his fate. The darkness around him grows thicker, and the secrets of the past begin to surface. The book remained open on the table. Its pages now seemed petrified, as if they no longer needed reading. I took a few steps back, trying to make sense of what I had heard and seen, but instead of understanding, I felt only deepening anxiety. The house began to shake, as if responding to my thoughts, and I realized that time did not stand still. I had to move on. After leaving the room, I found myself in a long corridor, which I did not remember from previous researches of the house. Its walls were covered with dark wooden panels, and the floor creaked with every step I took. Only a faint ray of light filtered in from the window at the end of the corridor, casting long shadows on the walls. I walked forward, and with each step I felt something invisible tighten around me. It was a feeling as if I was not alone, as if someone was watching me, hiding in the darkness of the corridor. This fear reminded me of the horrors I faced on the streets when I was working in the police, but now the feeling was many times stronger. The shadows on the walls began to move, changing shape, turning into something vague and whimsical. I saw faces floating by, whispering unintelligible words to me that blended in my head into a horrible chorus. I tried not to listen to them, not to pay attention, but they became louder and louder. Suddenly, the corridor began to change. The walls seemed to move like they were alive. The floor beneath my feet became shaky, as if ready to collapse. I knew I had to find a way out, but wherever I went, the corridor stretched like an endless road. And then I saw him. At the end of the corridor, at the very edge of the light, stood a man. His face was in shadow, but I recognized his figure immediately. It was the same man who had been chasing me from the beginning. He stood still, but his presence was felt in every corner of this cursed place. "You came," he said without moving his lips, but his words echoed clearly in my head. I raised my hand to my head, trying to muffle the voice, but it was no use. "Who are you?" I asked again. hoping to get at least some answer. "You know who I am," he replied. "I am a part of you, a part of your past. You created me yourself, and now you must meet me if you want to find a way out of this maze." I took a step forward, feeling the floor beneath my feet begin to shake again. But something made me stop. The shadows surrounding me began to take shape. They turned into figures of people I once knew, colleagues, friends, even casual acquaintances. They all looked at me reproachfully, as if accusing me of something I was trying to forget. "They are all your sins," said the man at the end of the corridor. "You can't run away from them, but you can decide what to do next." I felt something break inside me. I could no longer hide from myself, could not escape from the past. And although I was afraid, I realized that the only way out was to face my fears, to meet my past face to face. "I'm ready," I whispered, taking a step forward. The shadows around me began to disappear, disappearing into the darkness as if acknowledging my decision. The corridor stopped changing, and I finally felt solid ground under my feet. The man nodded, and his silhouette dissolved into the air. I was left alone, but now I knew that the way forward depended only on me. Jason ends up in a corridor where he is confronted with his past and the shadows that embody his fears and sins. He realizes that he cannot escape his past and decides to face his fears to find a way out. New challenges await him ahead, but now he knows that only he can overcome them. Leaving the corridor behind, I found myself in another room. This time it was a small room with peeling wallpaper and a large mirror on the wall. The room seemed completely empty, but the atmosphere was so tense that it was difficult for me to breathe. I looked at the mirror and saw my reflection, but it was distorted as if looking at itself through muddy water. My face seemed foreign, the wrinkles deeper, the eyes emptier. I felt an ancient fear awakening in my soul, the fear of losing myself, of losing control over my own consciousness. "What do you see?" The voice in my head sounded again. This time it was not as distant and cold as before, but more like my own, but with the flavor of something dark, sinister. "I see myself," I answered, although I wasn't sure it was true. "Really?" The voice laughed, and this laughter sent goosebumps through my skin. "What you see is what you fear to become, a reflection of your darkest fears, your deepest sins." I felt the mirror pull me towards it. My legs began to move forward on their own, bringing me closer to what seemed to be the inevitable. The reflection was changing before my eyes, turning into something unrecognizable. My face became more and more distorted, my eyes turned into empty black holes, and my mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. I tried to retreat, but it was too late. The mirror drew me into its world, pulled me along like an invisible magnet. I fought this urge, but my strength was fading. It was like a struggle with myself, with my dark side finally breaking free. And suddenly I realized that the only way to stop it was to accept what I was seeing. To accept one's fears and sins, not to hide from them, but to recognize them as a part of oneself. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, focusing on the feeling inside. The darkness that first threatened to engulf me now began to recede. When I opened my eyes, the mirror no longer attracted me. I saw my reflection, this time the real one, without distortion. I looked exhausted, but that was me. "You made the first move," the voice said again, but this time with warmth. "Accepting yourself is the hardest thing, but it's not the end." I carefully approached the mirror and touched its surface. It was cold, but real, tangible. I felt something shift inside of me, as if some part of the darkness retreated, giving way to something else, something light. But there were still many challenges ahead. I knew that this place was not just a house, but a labyrinth created by my own mind, my fears and memories. And to get out of it, I had to go through all its corridors, meet all the shadows that lived in me. Leaving the room behind, I felt the pressure on my shoulders begin to ease. I knew the next step would be even harder, but now I was ready. The shadows won't be able to stop me anymore. Jason faces a distorted reflection in the mirror, which embodies his deepest fears and sins. Realizing that he must accept these dark sides of himself in order to move forward, Jason takes the first step toward liberation. However, he knows that there are still many challenges ahead, and each of them will require new strength and determination from him. As soon as I left the room with the mirror, a new corridor opened before me, darker and colder than all the previous ones. The ceiling here was lower and the air heavier, like in a dungeon. All my instincts screamed of danger, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to move on. This corridor led to a heavy oak door that stood half open. Behind them, I heard muffled voices, as if someone was whispering in the dark. These voices seemed familiar, and at the same time, I couldn't tell who they belonged to. Every step that brought me closer to the door was echoed in my ears by the loud pounding of my heart, which was beating at an incredible speed. I carefully opened the door and found myself in a room that resembled an old basement. The walls were covered with dampness and felt cold. In the very center of the room stood a large wooden table on which lay old police files. Several chairs were arranged around the table, and each of them was occupied by a shadow. These shadows didn't have a clear shape, but I felt they were there for a purpose. The voices I heard earlier now became clearer. They were talking to each other, discussing something important. And it wasn't until I got closer that I realized those voices belonged to my colleagues from the past, those I'd lost a long time ago. "You should have known," one of them said, and I immediately recognized the voice of my partner, Dan. He was among those who died during one of the tasks when I was just starting my career. His voice was heavy, full of pain. "It's all on your conscience," added another voice that belonged to Kevin, another colleague who was no longer alive. I felt the cold seeping into my bones. All these people were part of my past, but I never thought I would meet them like this. They blamed me, and it was the most painful. My guilt was always hidden, vague, but now it was embodied in these voices that did not leave me alone. "Why did you abandon us?" came a third voice that belonged to a young woman who once worked with me. Her name was Sarah, and she died in the firefight when I failed to come to her aid in time. "It's not like that," I muttered, trying to justify myself, but the words stuck in my throat. I knew the truth was more complicated than that, but these shadows weren't interested in details. They were a reflection of my guilt, those moments when I could not save those who trusted me. "You must atone for your sins," Dan said, his voice growing louder over everyone else's. "You must find the way to the truth, even if it costs you everything." I lowered my head as I felt this room getting tighter and tighter. I was filled with horror and shame, but at the same time I knew I had to do something. I could not leave their voices unanswered. If I stop now, I will never find peace. "What should I do?" I asked, trying to find some clue in these ghostly voices. "But you already know the answer," Dan replied, his shadow disappearing, leaving only a cold void. "Find the one behind all this. That's the only way you can end your fear." One by one, the other voices began to fade away, leaving me alone in this basement. Only the old files on the desk remained as a reminder that I must find the answer. I knew these documents might contain clues, but would I be able to figure them out? Taking the first file, I began to look through it, and already on the first page I saw a familiar name. The name of someone I had been trying to forget for so long. Jason encounters the ghosts of his past, colleagues he lost because of his mistakes. They blame him for their downfall, and Jason realizes he must find the person behind it all. Old files on his desk give him his first clue, revealing a name he's tried to forget for a long time, but now that name becomes the key to the solution. On the first page of the file was written a name that took my breath away: Jackson Miller. I tried to erase this name from my memory for years, but it always returned in the darkest moments of my nightmares. Jackson was once my partner in the department, but his story ended horribly. He betrayed us all by siding with those we were trying to stop. I quickly flipped through the pages looking for any information that might explain his involvement in all that was happening now. The file was filled with reports, interrogation reports, but they all pointed to one thing. Jackson disappeared under mysterious circumstances after being accused of working with the mafia. His body was never found, and since then he has become a specter of my past, a shadow that has haunted me. This can't be a coincidence, I thought, reading between the lines. It seems that all the events that happened recently were connected with him. This is not just an ancient mistake. It is something much deeper, something that has remained unsolved until now. I flashed back to the last few days before he disappeared. At that time, the atmosphere in the department was tense. No one trusted each other, and everyone suspected the other of betrayal. But Jackson, he was always closer to the darkness than the rest. I should have seen it sooner, but I was blinded by our friendship, our work together. Suddenly, the light in the room began to flicker, and I realized that I was not alone. The feeling that someone was watching me returned with a new force. I looked around sharply but did not see anyone. However, this did not mean that the threat had disappeared. I felt the same cold again as before and realized that this house, these corridors and rooms were not just places. They live, and someone controls them, watches my every step. I decided I couldn't stay in this basement anymore. Taking the file with me, I quickly got out of the room, trying to remember all possible exits from the house. But the house seemed to change with every step, adapting to my actions. Every corridor now seemed longer, every door leading to the wrong place. Suddenly I heard a screeching sound that made me stop. It was the sound of footsteps, slow but heavy, as if someone was approaching from behind. I turned to see a dark figure standing at the end of the corridor. She didn't move, but her presence felt as if the shadow radiated hatred. "Jackson!" I involuntarily blurted out, but the figure did not answer. It just remained in place like an insurmountable obstacle on my way. I knew that this was not just an illusion, not another trick of this place. It was something much worse, a memory that came alive to haunt me. Unable to bear it, I rushed forward, determined to confront this horror. The figure disappeared as soon as I approached, leaving me alone with my own fears. But I didn't stop because I knew there was no going back now. The solution was waiting for me in front of me, and I was ready to do anything to find it. Jackson Miller was the key to all of this, and if I want to stop what started, I'll have to uncover all the secrets surrounding his betrayal and disappearance. I kept walking, holding the file tightly in my hands, knowing that each step brought me closer to the truth and to the greatest challenge of my life. Jason finds the name of Jackson Miller in old police files and realizes that everything that is happening is connected to this man. Memories of Jackson's betrayal come flooding back, fueling his fears. A dark figure he sees in the hallway reminds him of a ghost from the past, and Jason decides he must find answers, even if it puts him on the line between life and death. Leaving behind the dark corridor, I found myself in front of a new door. They were old and heavy, covered in rust, as if no one had touched them in decades. I could feel the cold wind blowing the last vestiges of calm out of me, but I couldn't back down. I needed to keep moving forward to find out the truth. I slowly opened the door and found myself in a large hall lit only by the soft, flickering light of a few candles. The hall was empty, except for one detail that made me freeze. An old map lay on the floor, laid out as if someone had left it for me specifically. This map looked like a detailed plan of this house, with all its corridors, rooms, and hidden passages. I came closer and saw that there were several marks on the map made with red paint. They pointed to certain places in the house that I had not yet visited. It was too suspicious, but I knew it might be the only way to find answers. "You have to find me," came a soft whisper that echoed throughout the hall. I looked around sharply but did not see anyone. Only then did I realize that the voice I heard belonged to Jackson Miller. It was as if he was inviting me to find him. But what awaited me when I reached the end of this path? I picked up the map and decided to follow the markings. They led me to some of the darkest parts of the house I had ever been through. These places were enveloped in thick darkness, and every step in them was harder. It felt like the house was trying to stop me, testing my resolve. The first passage led me to a small room where a symbol reminiscent of an ancient ritual was laid out on the floor. There was a strong smell of candles and incense in the air. I didn't know what exactly happened here, but this place breathed death and fear. Further on, another room was marked on the map, but the way to it was blocked by a heavy door that would not open even with my efforts. I was starting to lose hope when I heard a sound coming from outside the door. It was like a child's cry, quiet and frightened. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it wasn't a real baby. This is another trick, an attempt to drive me crazy, but I couldn't ignore the sound. I tried again, and this time the door gave way, creaking open. I entered a small room and saw an old baby doll lying on the floor, broken and mutilated. The crying disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. I realized that this place was not only reflecting my fears, but was using my deepest emotions to break me. But I had no right to stop. Whatever was ahead of me, I had to see it through. The last mark on the map indicated an underground tunnel leading even deeper under the house. I found an old wooden staircase leading down and, gathering my strength, began to descend. Every step down seemed like a step into the abyss. The darkness grew denser and the air heavier. At the bottom, I was greeted by another corridor, but this one was different. It was completely enveloped in black gloom, in which it was impossible to see even my hands. I walked at random, guided only by my feelings and inner compass. There was no room for doubt, only determination. At last, I saw something ahead, a faint flicker of light that seemed to be the only source of hope in this sea of darkness. I got closer and realized that it was a small lamp glowing near a wooden table. On the table was a book, old and worn, and next to it was a key. I picked up the book and started flipping through the pages. It was handwritten, and every entry in it belonged to Jackson Miller. These were his diaries where he talked about his terrible deeds, about his plans, and how he manipulated others. He described every step he took, every decision that led him to betrayal. The key was the last piece of the puzzle. I didn't know what it was leading to, but I felt it was leading to the end of this nightmare. I took a deep breath and stood up, ready for the final challenge. All that was left was to find where that key fit and unravel the mystery of Jackson Miller that kept me in this house. Jason, following the markings on the map, passes through the darkest corners of the house, where each room tests his endurance and determination. Eventually, he finds Jackson Miller's journals and the key that leads to the ultimate solution. Jason prepares for the final test, feeling that the end of this horror is near. I was standing in front of the wooden door where the key had led me. They looked as old and neglected as the whole house, but I felt that there was something extremely important hiding behind them. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the keyhole, but I forced myself to continue. Now there was no room for fear, only for determination and readiness to face what awaited me. The lock clicked softly and the door opened with a dull creak. Behind them was another corridor, but this one was completely different from all the previous ones. It was clean, illuminated by a soft light, and it did not exude the fear that haunted me until now. The place seemed almost normal, and that worried me more than anything. I walked forward, and with each step I got the feeling that I was getting closer to finally understanding what was really going on. But at the same time, fear tangibly squeezed my heart, as if anticipating an imminent disaster. The corridor led me to a small room. There were only a few objects inside: a table, a chair, and a large mirror on the wall. The mirror immediately caught my attention. It was old, with scratches on the frame, but it seemed that there was something more than just a reflection behind it. I slowly walked over to the mirror and looked at myself. Of course I expected to see my reflection, but something wasn't right about it. The eyes staring back at me from the mirror were not mine. They belonged to another person, a person I knew well. It was Jackson Miller's eyes. What I saw took my breath away. The mirror did not show me, but him. I took a few steps back, trying to understand what it meant, but at the same moment the mirror began to change. The image began to shake, and suddenly a scene from the past appeared before me. I saw myself and Jackson at the old police station where we worked together. That was the night everything changed. We received a call for another assignment, but something went wrong. I remembered the moment when Jackson decided to take a step into the darkness, to betray us all for his own gain. In the mirror, I saw him approaching me, holding a weapon in his hand. I knew what would happen next. He would try to kill me so that no one would find out about his betrayal. But this time, something changed. I saw my own fear in his eyes, but I also saw my determination. I didn't give him a chance. He took off, but I was ahead of him. The weapon in my hand went faster. Jackson fell to the floor, and I could see the life slowly leaving his body. It was a moment I tried to forget, but it always stayed with me, hidden deep in my subconscious. The mirror shattered, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I finally realized that the real enemy was not Jackson, but myself. My guilt, my fear, my determination to stand up for what I thought was right had led to this moment. I turned to the table and saw another item, an old photo card of me and Jackson. It was a time when we were not just partners, but friends. But those days are gone, and all that remains are memories of betrayal and death. I couldn't stay in this place anymore. I slowly left the room, leaving behind all the horrors that haunted me. But even after leaving this house, I knew that the real fear would always be with me. It lives in my heart, in my soul. Jason finds a door that leads him to a defining moment where he finally faces the truth about himself and Jackson. The mirror shows him the memories he has tried to forget, revealing his guilt and the pain of losing his friend. He understands that the real enemy has always been inside himself, and that this is not just a horror. It is his reality, with which he must now live. I got out of that horrible house, but the feeling of relief never came. On the contrary, everything inside me was torn apart by pain and fear that I had never felt before. It seemed that this house had left a mark on my soul that would never disappear. I was walking down an empty street that dissolved into the darkness of the night. The city slept, unaware of the horrors I had experienced. But the night brought no relief for me. Every step, every sound reminded me of what had happened. The mirror, Jackson, those memories, they all seemed to haunt me even as I tried to escape. When I finally got to my car, my hands were shaking so much that I could barely fit the key in the lock. I got behind the wheel but could not start the engine. I just sat there in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window. It no longer felt like mine. My eyes were empty, lifeless, as if the part of me that was once alive had stayed in that house with Jackson. I tried to call my boss, but I couldn't get a word out. What could I say to him? What did you see in the mirror? That Jackson Miller is not only the one who betrayed us, but also the part of me I've tried to hide for so long? The phone fell from my hands and I closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would bring at least some relief. But even in the dark, even with my eyes closed, I could see his face. I saw the night that everything changed when I killed Jackson, convinced that I was making the right choice. My heart felt like it was going to explode from all the emotions that were pouring out. But tears did not come. I was too broken to cry. All that remained was the pain and despair that held me in its arms. I didn't know how long I spent in the car before I finally started the engine and headed home. The road was deserted, and I could see shadows in every glare of the street lamps. They looked at me as if they were judging me, reminding me that I would never be the same again. When I arrived home, the house seemed cold and alien. Nothing about it brought comfort or peace. I closed the door behind me and slowly went to the bedroom. But even here there was no salvation. Every corner, every shadow reminded me of what I saw in that mirror. I lay down in bed, but sleep did not come. Closing my eyes, I saw again those terrible scenes that took place in that house. I saw Jackson. I saw his eyes full of anger and fear. I could feel him sneaking up on me, ready to deliver the final blow. But every night in this nightmare was the same thing. I was ahead of him. Over and over again, I saw myself pull the trigger and Jackson fall to the ground, and each time I felt the same terror and despair that had haunted me since that night. Every day I lost control of reality more and more. Nightmares did not leave me, haunted me day and night. I saw Jackson in reflections, in shadows, in every casual glance of passers-by. I knew I wouldn't be able to live that long. Whenever I tried to forget, whenever I tried to distract myself, these images came back with new force. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was becoming part of this nightmare from which there was no way out. But the worst thing was that I couldn't tell anyone what happened. No one could understand. How could I explain that the mirror showed me my own fears, that my greatest enemy was myself? At night, when the whole world was asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness. I knew Jackson was around. I knew he would come back to finish what was started years ago. And every time I closed my eyes, I felt that the end was near. Jason leaves the house, but his soul remains broken. Memories of events haunt him in every reflection, in every shadow. He tries to return to a normal life, but nightmares do not give him peace. He loses control of reality, feeling that the end is near. Every day I started with the same routine, a face in the mirror that no longer felt like mine, black and blue circles under my eyes that indicated sleepless nights. But today something has changed. Today, when I looked in the mirror, for a moment it seemed to me that someone was standing behind me. My heart sank with fear, and I turned sharply, but there was no one in the room. It seemed like it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I felt like it wasn't just a ghost. It was something more, something real. I tried to distract myself by doing my usual work, but even that didn't help. Every ring, every sound made me shudder. Thoughts kept swirling in my head that this wouldn't end, that Jackson wouldn't leave me alone until I completed some task I didn't yet understand. In the evening, when I finally decided to go to work to escape from my thoughts for a little while, my boss called me. He asked to meet him at the station, said that there was something important. My fear only grew. What if it had something to do with what I had experienced? What if all this really makes sense and is pulling me into a vortex of events from which I cannot escape? I drove to work in complete silence, afraid to even turn on the radio lest I hear some mysterious message. The streets seemed empty. Even the city that never slept was dead today. When I arrived at the branch, I was greeted by a strange atmosphere. Everyone seemed to know something I didn't. The boss was waiting for me in his office. His face was serious, his eyes looking at me as if he saw something bigger than me. He silently pointed to a chair and I sat down, feeling the fear rise inside me. "Jason, I know what you're going through," he began, breaking the silence. "I know you can't find peace after that incident with Jackson. But there is something you should know." My heart was beating faster and faster. What else could he tell me? What could be worse than what I've already experienced? "You're not the only one who sees him," said the chief. His words sounded like a sentence. "We received messages from other officers who worked with him. They all saw Jackson. They all felt his presence. I was stunned. It wasn't just my imagination. Others also saw what I saw. But what did that mean? What kind of secret was Jackson hiding? What made him come back?" "I don't know what it is," continued the chief, "but we all understand that this is not just a coincidence. Jackson was special. He left a mark that will not disappear so easily." I didn't know what to answer. Thousands of thoughts swirled in my head, but none of them answered my questions. I felt that I was standing on the threshold of something terrible, something that could destroy everything I had known before. "Jason," said the chief again, "you must go back to where it all began. Go back and find the answers." These words sounded like an order that I could not avoid. I knew that going back to that house would be the end for me, but at the same time I knew that it was the only way to deal with what was haunting me. I left the office without saying a word. I walked as if in a dream, not noticing what was happening around me. Thoughts were occupied with only one thing: returning to the house that was the beginning of my nightmare. Jason learns that he's not the only one seeing Jackson. The other officers also sense his presence, which makes him doubt even more the reality of what is happening. The boss advises him to go back to the house where it all started to find answers. Jason realizes that this could be the end, but understands that there is no other way out. I sat in my car, keys in hand, but I couldn't bring myself to drive. It seemed to me that these few minutes spent here in relative safety were the last moments of my life when I could still feel human. Returning to that house meant facing all the fears and nightmares that haunted me. I didn't know what was waiting for me inside, but I felt that I would never leave this place the same as I was before. Darkness came quickly, covering the city with fog and cold. It was just the kind of night when you feel that something terrible is lurking around every corner. The streets were empty, only a few headlights of other cars flickered in the distance. I knew I needed to move, but fear held me back. Finally, gathering all my will into a fist, I started the engine and slowly moved towards the same house. The road to him seemed endless. Every turn seemed to bring me closer to the abyss. I tried to remember those moments when I was still me, when life seemed simpler. But these memories were like distant dreams that dissolved in the darkness. When I finally drove up to the house, a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. From the outside, the house looked the same as it always did. Old, run down, with half-broken windows and a broken porch. But inside, he hid something more terrible, something that could destroy me completely. I got out of the car, leaving the engine running. The heart was pounding in the chest as if it wanted to break out. I made my way to the door, feeling my every step grow heavier. There was something wrong in the air, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. When I was finally in front of the door, my hand hung in the air for a moment, hesitating, but I knew I couldn't go back. Opening the door, I stepped inside and the darkness engulfed me. The house seemed even more gloomy than I remembered. Every corner, every sound reinforced the feeling that I was not alone here. I walked slowly down the corridor, trying not to make any sudden movements, but each step echoed in the silence like an echo in empty space. Everything here was as I had left it on that terrible day. Even the dust that settled on the furniture didn't seem to change. I walked on, feeling the fear rise inside me, as every cell in my body begged me to leave this place. Finally, I found myself in the room where it all began. The mirror was still in place, but now it looked different. I approached him without taking my eyes off him. The reflection showed not only me, but something more, something that did not belong to this world. My hand was shaking as I reached for the mirror. I knew it could be a trap, that it could be my last step, but I couldn't stop myself. When my fingers touched the cold surface, something changed. The mirror began to vibrate as if an invisible current was passing through it. I thought I heard a voice calling my name. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't stand still anymore. I took a step back, but the reflection remained in place, not moving with me. It was looking straight at me, and I realized it wasn't me anymore. It was something else, something pretending to be me. Suddenly, the room was filled with cold and the light went out, leaving me in complete darkness. Only the reflection in the mirror was still burning, emitting a strange, ominous light. And then I saw him. Jackson was standing right behind me. His face was contorted with anger and pain, but his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me with trust, now burned with hatred. He didn't speak, but I could hear his voice in my head, like the cry of a restless soul. I realized that Jackson would never leave me. He came after me to finish what we started together. I knew this was the moment I would either find answers or be lost in this nightmare forever. Jason returns to the house where it all began, trying to find answers to his questions. A sense of dread and darkness surrounds him as he confronts his reflection in the mirror, which shows him something more than just himself. He sees Jackson behind him and understands that this is not the end, but only the beginning of something even more terrible. I stood in front of the mirror, feeling panic tear my body apart. Jackson was there, reflected, his eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with life. I tried to move away, but I felt as if I was chained to the place by something. My legs did not obey, and my every movement seemed heavy and powerless. The sounds grew louder, like a loud hum that filled the room. I heard screams, moans that merged into one, forming a terrible symphony. I could feel my mind floating and thoughts becoming fuzzy. I couldn't focus, and every bit of reality seemed to be falling apart. Suddenly, the darkness in the room became even thicker, and I saw how the mirror began to change. It turned into a dark abyss that absorbed all the light around it. Jackson, whose face was still reflected, began to slowly walk out of the mirror. His figure, full of hatred and malicious energy, seemed closer and more real. I made one last attempt to save myself, trying to find a way out of the room. I rushed to the door, but it was blocked by an invisible force. I turned around, and Jackson was already standing in front of me. His face was so close I could feel his cold breath on my skin. "You will not escape!" His voice was silent, but loud in my head. "I am always here, always with you." I realized that I couldn't run away from it anymore. All my struggle was in vain, and now I was facing my own nightmare. My hands reached forward but found nothing to grab onto. I could feel my body becoming part of the darkness that enveloped me. I was in the dark, and everything around me was as black as the abyss. I felt this space engulfing me, and every movement seemed blurred and heavy. The sensations were getting stronger, and suddenly everything quieted down. I was alone, with no sound, no light, no sign of life. In this absolute darkness, I felt Jackson's presence. It was as if he was standing nearby and his hatred was a part of the place. I tried to remember why I was here and realized that it wasn't just my decision to come back. It was more. It was an obligation imposed on me, something that was part of a greater plan. Suddenly, I saw his face again. Jackson stood before me, his eyes burning with anger and accusation. His lips moved, but there was no sound. He was showing me what I had to do, and I knew I had to finish what I had started by solving the mystery of this nightmare. I walked over to the mirror, which was now a portal to another world. I felt my body dissolve into the darkness, and my fears and pains become part of this terrible space. I knew that my path led to the end, and there was no turning back. Jackson reappeared, but now his face was not distorted by hatred. Instead, he looked at me with an expression of understanding. I realized that he was not my enemy, but the nightmare that I had created. My own fear and guilt became part of this horrible world. I went closer to the mirror and looked at my reflection. It was not my true face, but rather a distorted reflection of my fears and terrors. I realized that my real punishment was not death, but life in this endless horror, where every day would be filled with fear and pain. With one last look at my reflection, I knew I was going to stay here forever. I became a part of this world, a part of the darkness that will never let me go. And while I was there watching the reflection, I felt all this terror and pain merge into one. I was left alone in this darkness, and all my struggles, all my fears became part of this eternal nightmare. And now, when I look in that mirror, I see not only my own face, but that I have become a part of something far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The finale came, and it was not what I expected. I found no release, no peace. I found only darkness, and in that darkness I remained forever.